In 2005, the literacy rate in Laos was estimated to be 73%. Education before the Lao People's Democratic Republic. Of the many ethnic groups in Laos, only the Lao Lum had a tradition of formal education, reflecting the fact that the languages of the other groups had no written script. Until the mid-20th century, education was primarily based in the Buddhist temple school, where the monks taught novices and other boys to read both Lao and Pali scripts, basic arithmetic, and other religious and social subjects. Many villages had Wat schools for novices and other village boys. However, only ordained boys and men in urban monasteries had access to advanced study. During the colonial period, the French established a secular education system patterned after schools in France, and French was the language of instruction after the second or third grade. This system was largely irrelevant to the needs and lifestyles of the vast majority of the rural population, despite its extension to some district centers and a few villages. However, it did produce a small elite drawn primarily from the royal family and noble households. Many children of Vietnamese immigrants to Laos, who made up the majority of the colonial civil service, attended these schools and, in fact, constituted a significant proportion of the students at secondary levels in urban centers. Post-secondary education was not available in Laos, and the few advanced students traveled to Hanoi, Da Nang, and Huiacute in Vietnam and to Phnom Penh in Cambodia for specialized training. Fewer still continued with university-level studies in France. The Pathet Lao began to provide Lao language instruction in the schools under its control in the late 1950s, and a Laotian curriculum began to be developed in the late 1960s in the Rlg Schools. In 1970, about one-third of the civilian employees of the Rlg were teachers, although the majority of these were poorly paid and minimally trained elementary teachers. At that time, there were about 200,000 elementary students enrolled in Rlg schools, around 36% of the school-age population. Education since 1975. An important goal of the Lao People's Democratic Republic government was to establish a system of universal primary education by 1985. The LPDR took over the existing Royal Lao government education system that had been established in 1950s and restructured it, facing many of the same problems that had confronted previous governments. The French system of education was replaced with a Laotian curriculum, although lack of teaching materials has impeded effective instruction. An intensive adult literacy campaign was initiated in 1983-84, which mobilized educated persons living in villages and urban neighborhoods to bring basic reading and writing skills to over 750,000 adults. Largely as a result of this campaign, those able to read and write had increased to an estimated 44%. According to the United Nations, by 1985 those able to read and write were estimated at 92% of men and 76% of women ages 15 to 45. Because few reading materials are available, especially in the rural areas, many newly literate adults lose much of their proficiency after a few years. The decision to establish universal education led the government to focus its efforts on building and staffing schools in nearly every village. Because resources are limited, most schools are poorly constructed, of bamboo and thatch, and staffed by one or two teachers who are paid low wages, usually in arrears. Many village schools have only one or two grades. Books, paper, or other teaching materials are conspicuous by their scarcity. School enrollment has increased since 1975. In 1988, primary school enrollment was estimated at 63% of all school-aged children. In 1992-93, an estimated 603,000 students were in primary school, compared to 317,000 students in 1976 and 100,000 students in 1959. However, the goal of achieving universal primary education was postponed from 1985 to 2000 as a result of the lack of resources. Because teachers are paid irregularly, they are forced to spend significant amounts of time farming or in other livelihood activities, with the result that in many locations classes are held for only a few hours a day. Because of irregular classes, overcrowding, and lack of learning resources, the average student needed 11 to 12 years to complete the 5-year primary course in the late 1980s. Repetition rates ranged from 40% for the first grade to 14% for the 5th grade. Dropouts were a significant problem, with 22% of all entering first graders leaving school before the 2nd grade. In the late 1980s, only 45% of entering first graders completed all 5 years of primary school, up from 18% in 1969. Performance statistics vary according to rural-urban location, ethnic group, and gender. Enrollment and school quality are higher in urban areas, where the usefulness of a formal education is more evident than in rural farming communities. Isolated teachers confronted with primitive rural living and teaching conditions have a difficult time maintaining their own commitment as well as the interest of their pupils. Ethnic minority students who have no tradition of literacy and who do not speak Lao have a particularly difficult time, unless the teacher is of the same or similar ethnic group as the students. Communication and culturally appropriate education are limited. Because of these factors, in the late 1980s the enrollment rate for the Lao Sung was less than half that of the Lao Lum. Enrollment was also low for Lao Thung children. Girls are less likely than boys to attend school and attend for fewer years, a discrepancy that was declining, however, in the early 1990s. In 1969 only 37% of students in primary school were girls. By 1989, however, 44% of primary school students were girls. Because of Lao Sung cultural attitudes toward girls and women's responsibilities, girls in these groups accounted for only 26% of all students. Secondary education enrollment has expanded since 1975, but as of mid-1994 was still limited in availability and scope. In 1992-93 only about 130,000 students were enrolled in all post-primary programs, including lower and upper secondary schools, vocational programs, and teacher training schools. The exodus of Laotian elite after 1975 deprived vocational and secondary schools of many of their staff, a situation that was only partly offset by students returning from training in socialist countries. Between 1975 and 1990, the government granted over 14,000 scholarships for study in at least 8 socialist countries. Just over 7,000 were to the Soviet Union, followed by 2,500 to Vietnam, and 1,800 to the German Democratic Republic. In mid-1994 the school year was 9 months. The ideal sequence included 5 years of primary school, followed by 3 years of lower secondary school and 3 years of upper secondary school. In 2010, another year was added to upper secondary school, for a total of 12 years of primary and secondary education. Some students go directly from primary or lower secondary school to vocational instruction, for example, in teacher training schools or agriculture schools. Local secondary education is concentrated in the provincial capitals and some district centers. Dropout rates for students at secondary and technical schools are not as high as among primary students, but the gender and ethnic group differentials are more pronounced. In the late 1980s, only 7% of lower secondary students were Lao Sung or Lao Thung, a rate that dropped to 3% in upper secondary school. For most students who do not live in a provincial center, attendance at secondary school requires boarding away from home in makeshift facilities. This situation further discourages students in rural areas from pursuing further education, with additional differential impacts on girls and minorities. Vientiane has the majority of advanced schools, including the National Teachers Training School at Zhongdok, the Irrigation College at Tat Thong, the Agriculture College at Nha Phok, the National Polytechnic Institute, and the University of Medical Sciences. Even so, the level of training available at these schools is low. In 1986, the government began to reform the education system, with the goals of linking educational development more closely to the socio-economic situation in each locality, improving science training and emphasis, expanding networks to remote mountainous regions, and recruiting minority teachers. The plan envisioned making education more relevant to daily realities and building increased cooperation in educational activities among the ministries, mass organizations, and the community. However, the ability to implement this program through its scheduled completion in 2000 depended on a significant budgetary increase to the education sector in addition to receiving significant foreign aid. Education accounted for only 8% of government expenditures in 1988, down from a 10% to 15% range during the preceding 7-year period, and cultural expenditures were not accorded a high priority. Although more school texts and general magazines are being printed, poor distribution systems and budgetary constraints limit their availability throughout the country. Overall, 3.9 million books were printed in 1989, including school texts published by the Ministry of Education, and novels, stories, and poems published by the Ministry of Information and Culture. Translations into Lao of Russian language technical, literary, and children's books were available through the Novosti Press Agency. Virtually all these materials are inexpensive paper-bound editions. Distribution of school texts is improving, and magazines and novels can occasionally be found in district markets distant from Vientiane. Type-printed material, for the most part, magazines and books, was available after the late 1980s in a few shops. Yet, in the early 1990s, it was rare to see a book or any other reading material in rural villages. With the exception of political posters or a month-old edition of the newspaper Ziang Passasin pasted on a house wall. Education in Laos. Refer to page Education in Laos for updated education information. Development challenge in Laos's education system. The Lao population of 4.9 million is ethnically and linguistically diverse. The government has defined 49 ethnic groups, many having their own language. School attendance, literacy, and other indicators of educational attainment vary greatly among different ethnic groups. Census data from 1995 revealed that 23% of the Lao never went to school as compared with 34, 56, and 67% for Phu Thai, KHMU, and Hmong. Among two of the smallest ethnic groups, 94% of the Kor and 96% of the Musa never attended school. The quality of instruction tends to be poor, and nearly half of those who enter do not complete the primary cycle. Lao, the official and instructional language, is the first language of about 50% of the population. Children from homes where Lao is not spoken enter schools with a significant handicap, a condition partly accounting for the high dropout rate. Changing the language of instruction would be a complex problem. However, steps can be taken by schools to assist non-Lao-speaking pupils. The rural quality of Laos implicates the provision of education as urbanization facilitates educational delivery. It is more expensive to provide schools for each small village than to build a smaller number of large schools in cities. These rural-urban differences are even more significant for provision of secondary, technical or vocational schools given the higher unit costs involved. The quantity and quality of schooling are influenced by demographic structures and are highly sensitive to the size of the school age cohort. The extremely young population of Lao PDR puts a heavy burden on schooling and, at the same time, the high dependency ratio contributes to the low national productivity. Large families force choices as to which children go to school, tending to suppress female enrollments and indirectly reducing the number of subsequent opportunities for girls in education and in the labor market. The education system is evolving under severely constraining conditions of inadequately prepared and poorly paid teachers, insufficient funding, shortages of facilities, and often ineffective allocation of the limited resources available. There is significant geographic, ethnic, gender and wealth disparities in the distribution of educational services, and inequalities exist in every level of the system. NGO Aid Action is trying to increase the education of the people in Laos by promoting access to school for the disadvantaged, improving the quality of primary education and supporting and encouraging education programs for children migrant and geographically inaccessible. AEA hopes to prevent the exclusion and marginalization that is occurring throughout the country. AEA is employing a two-prong approach to tackle this problem of low education levels in Laos. On one hand, it is trying to lay some basic infrastructure, which can aid this effort to increase the national education level and literacy rates. A couple of libraries have been built and are operational. On the other hand, AEA is training locals to be adequately qualified and skilled to run and management libraries so as to be able to benefit from the libraries. School headmasters have been trained on school management, and teachers have been trained to use of the pre-primary education project curriculum, class facilitation and on early childhood education and in a pilot phase to promote reading and pre-primary education in Laos. This is essential, as AEA, being an international organization, most probably would not be well versed in the local culture and procedures. Hence, by being involved in joint efforts with local organizations, it enables AEA to reach areas and people that it otherwise would not have reached. This makes the projects more effective. Bibliography. Evans, Grant. 1998. The Politics of Ritual and Remembrance. Laos since 1975. Honolulu. University of Hawaii Press. Evans, Grant. 2002. A Short History of Laos, The Land in Between. Crown's Nest, NSW. Allen and Unwin. Faming, Many Nooch. 2007. Schooling in the Lao People's Democratic Republic and Going to School in East Asia, edited by Gerard A. Postiglione and Jason Tan. Westport, Con. London. Greenwood Press. Faming, Many Nooch. 2008. National Integration. Education for Ethnic Minorities in Laos. Ph.D. Thesis, Hong Kong. University of Hong Kong. Fry, Gerald W. 2002. Laos, Education System, in Encyclopedia of Modern Asia, edited by David Levinson and Karian Christensen. New York, Charles Scribner's Group. Thompson, Gail.